My name is Sheila Corona. Welcome back to another chapter of A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu. For those of you who are following along with me, either in the free PDF that can be found easily, just Google A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu, or in at least some of these videos. I'm going to try to make sure that they're in the show more section of all of them. You'll find a link to that PDF file. We're on chapter 9. In this particular one, it is page 136, and it begins. I had a wonderful night's sleep. I awoke this morning at the usual hour, much refreshed, but without recollection of anything having happened during the night. My list of questions is ready, and I hope Achara will not consider it too lengthy. I was rereading my questions when the door opened, and Achara greeted me with, "There is no need to apologize for the number of your questions. I have discouraged your asking questions regularly because I knew much would become clear to you with personal experiences at the astral level, and too many interruptions do not help either the speaker or the listener. I shall do my best to answer your question in language which should clarify your difficulties." Question. In your talks, you've never mentioned anything about the conventional heaven to which the bulk of Christians are taught to aspire. Is there such a place, or does it only exist in the imagination of priests and ministers of religion who insist on its existence? Answer. There is certainly no such place as heaven, but there is a state of consciousness which is often referred to as heaven by the people living under those conditions. Some people argue that the state of consciousness is found in the higher stages of the astral world, whereas others insist that it is found in the mental world only. Some people argue that there is a difference between that which is called paradise and that which is called heaven. You will remember the Christ speaking to the penitent thief is reported to have said, "This day shalt thou be with me in paradise." Paradise was the name given by the Greeks to the upper regions of the astral plane, and they taught that heaven was found in the mental world, after man had left the astral world on his journey back to the home of the soul or ego. At these higher levels, some men surround themselves with the thought forms of seraphim and cherubim, in strict accordance with the ancient Hebrew scriptures. It is perfectly real to them, and it harms no one if they are content to think it all real. So why worry them? Many of them even make thought forms of God or St. Peter, and nothing that you could say would convince them that they are living in a state of illusion. There will come a day when they have developed their intellect a little more, when they will begin to try to ascertain what is fact and what is illusion. I notice that although you ask about the conventional heaven, you have not mentioned the conventional hell. That, of course, no more exists than heaven exists. But usually one does not find people in the astral world making thought forms of a conventional hell and living under such conditions. For no one is ever so self-critical as to be quite sure that hell is the right place for him. Most of the people who live surrounded by the thought forms of their idea of a conventional heaven are only too happy to exist in such circumstances as they feel they have either earned the right to be there or have been extremely lucky to find themselves in a place for which they were not quite sure they had qualified. A conventional heaven created by people living at the mental level is quite different. Thought though it serves the same purpose for the people concerned. Question. You said in your third talk that you would explain the difference between an animal's life in the astral world and the life lived there by a human being. What is the difference? Answer. There is a considerable difference between the life of an animal in the astral world and that of a human being. In the case of the former, it seldom inhabits spheres of that world higher than the third. For that life, for the life that a man lives on the higher spheres has little interest for an animal. And only in exceptional cases does a human being take a favorite animal with him when he passes to the higher spheres. An animal certainly has a short sojourn at the astral level after each physical life has been lived, but it does not usually last for more than 10 to 15 years at the most. When the time comes for the group soul of which the animal is a part to reincarnate in new animal bodies, the animal entities which have been living separate existences in the astral level are again drawn back into the group soul, and their separate identities at once cease to be. The group soul then, when the group soul, when its various parts return to it, is colored by the experience of those several parts, and the life force of which the group soul is made up then splits itself into sections again, each section inhabiting a new animal entity, and further experiences are gained in these new bodies. As I have explained to you previously, this goes on until the group soul is ready to individualize as a human being. Those few years that an animal spends in the astral world are always happy, even in the very rare cases where a dog dies from a broken heart because its master gave it away or left it with strangers when he was forced to go on a long journey. Such an animal quickly finds a new home. In the astral world, you never see a dog ask for food, whereas you have seen for yourself many humans continue to eat and drink after death, merely because they have formed the habit of so doing. A dog or cat only eats when it's hungry and seldom from greed. At the astral level, it doesn't get hungry, so it never asks for food. A dog of the hunting species has during its life been trained to hunt. After death, it continues to do so. Its instinct is to look for its quarry, and that very looking is in itself a thought. So, a quarry immediately appears, and the dog at once chases it. Whether it catches it or not is of little importance, for the quarry, which is only a thought form, cannot be killed in the ordinary sense of the word, but the dog enjoys the chase, and its life continues to be a happy one. A horse, which during its lifetime has been a favorite hack of a natural lover of horses, soon finds another owner with a similar love of his kind, and the same routine goes on with the benefit and pleasure to both horse and rider. In some cases, after a favorite animal has died, its owner in the world thinks strongly about it when he goes to sleep at night. The animal feels the, quote, call, and sometimes is able to contact its late owner and share a few hours of his company. Unfortunately, this is not a desirable thing, for the horse or dog feels the loss of its late master when such a person has to return to his physical body after the sleep period is completed. Therefore, it is kinder that they should be allowed to attach themselves to new masters or mistresses. There are rare cases where the affection between a human being and his pet is so strong that the group soul of which the animal is a part is in its way linked with that human being. This can only happen towards the end of the group soul period, when it is divided into only two parts, awaiting time for its individualization as a human being. Because the human being has done so much for that group soul by helping to eradicate the last vestige of fear from animals attached to him, the entire soul group, consisting of two dogs or two cats, for example, has 2 or 3 consecutive lives in the same household. In this way, the time when individualization can take place is often considerably shortened. I could tell you of authentic instances of this happening, but my time is limited. The period that an animal spends in the astral world is too short for the conditions ruling there to influence deeply the evolution of the group soul. So when that period is over, the animals disappear from the homes to which they have attached themselves to return to their group souls for new incarnations in the physical world, where further experience is gained. Question. Why is it that Charles did not contact us on the second astral journey? Is it that he is no longer interested in me owing to his new life being so very different and more thrilling than the physical one? Or can he not join up with us without your assistance? Answer. I'm very pleased that you have raised these queries, for though it will take me some time to explain what you want to know, it is most necessary that you should be clear as to why opportunities of movement at the astral level vary for temporary visitors and permanent residents. Whilst physical life continues, the astral body is an auxiliary body, but it is used by you during sleeping hours for activities in the astral world. That body, composed of astral matter, has particles in it relative to all the different spheres of the astral world. And so long as you have a physical body, these particles are intermingled one with the other. You are able to travel to any sphere of the astral world, up or down, merely by exercising your willpower. And in accordance with the sphere to which you go, these particles of your astral body become active and make such journeys possible. To make it complete, to make it perfectly clear, when you are sojourning on the first sphere, the particles relative to that sphere are at that time active. But when you pass from the first sphere, for example, to the fourth, it means that the fourth sphere particles become active, whilst the particles relating to the other spheres remain dormant, so long as your activities are at the fourth sphere level. As long as you have a physical body, this process goes on. But when the physical body is dropped at the moment of death, the astral body, which before was a mass of revolving particles, all intermingling, rearranges itself into an entirely different form. In order that you should understand this perfectly, try and visualize the astral body after death as an ovoid, like an orange, with a core and with 7 separate and distinct skins surrounding that core. The core represents the permanent atom relating to all the different spheres of matter relative to the 7 different spheres that exist in the astral level, of which you now know something. And at the moment of death, The astral body so rearranges the matter of which it is composed that the outside or densest skin is made up of atoms similar to those which you require to function on the first or densest sphere of that world. When, after a period of time, you leave the first sphere and pass to the second, you drop that outer skin, leaving the atoms relative to the second sphere of that world, which now become active on the outside of your body. The same thing applies when you pass to higher levels. In passing, each outer skin drops away and leaves the skin beneath it, which at once becomes active and enables you to be fully conscious in the sphere to which you have passed. Now, if you wish to pass down again from, let us say, the fourth to the first sphere, it is necessary for a permanent resident to call upon the atoms contained within the core of the orange, the permanent atom, in order to effect that change. This requires a much greater effort of will than in the case of the temporary sojourner, for he must draw around his astral body yet again a new skin relative to the astral matter of this sphere in which he wishes to function. Charles did not accompany us on our second astral journey because I did not invite him to do so. Therefore, he did not know that such a journey was contemplated. You can now realize that had we taken Charles with us on that journey, it would have been necessary for me to explain to him in detail the machinery that would have had to be employed to enable him to get back to the first sphere where he is still living. It is not because Charles is finding life at the astral level so full that you have not seen him during the past few days, but simply that the average individual who lives in the astral world does not hanker after contacts with people living in our world in the same way that you wished to make contact with Charles immediately after his death. You ask if Charles could join up with us without any assistance. Most certainly he could, providing he thought about us sufficiently strongly to make that desire known to us. He could, for example, wait in your bedroom every night if he wished, for the moment when you pass out of your physical body. Then he could make known to you his wish to accompany you wherever you go. He has not shown this strong inclination, so you have not had any contact with him lately. In case you are worried, let me assure you that Charles, at the moment, is busy with a temporary attraction which he has for a member of the opposite sex, who has recently died. He is very happy showing her around and proving to her how much more he knows about conditions than she does at present. My suggestion to you is to leave him alone for the time being, as I think that later you will link up with him again for your mutual benefit. Question. You have not mentioned why some people are born cripples and others blind, others again deaf and dumb. Is there a reason? Answer. There certainly is a reason, and my few remarks relating to the law of karma or cause and effect should have answered the question for you. It is essential for you to impress quite clearly on your mind that all such tragedies are produced entirely by the individuals concerned, by their actions in previous lives, and are not due to an evil creator who likes to see humans suffer. A child is sometimes born a cripple because in a previous life he was the cause of extreme suffering to another human being or to an animal. A man may, in a drunken rage, beat a child so cruelly that the beating produces a physical deformity, which medical science is unable to cure. This would undoubtedly cause such a man to be born a cripple in his next life, and so be forced to suffer in something of the same way. People are sometimes born deaf and dumb for the reason that, in a previous life, they had been unfortunate enough to be a parent of a deaf and dumb child, when instead of making family conditions happy for such a person, the parent showed his disappointment at having a child which was abnormal by taking it out on the poor creature, who could not defend itself, thereby making life much worse for it than it need have been. Even evolved beings who know the reason for children being born cripples or abnormal in any way sometimes fail to realize that having an abnormal child is an exceedingly fine opportunity for them to make good karma by treating it with much empathy, sympathy, and understanding. You may argue that justice today is very different from justice in the past, but the unthinking actions of our past lives must be paid for, even though in those past incarnations, man was less sensitive to pain than he is today and used to much more ruthless treatment. Do not forget that it is the intention which decides the amount of suffering. Similar karmic consequences follow on emotional and mental cruelty. Quite often, one sees a mother who is a widow putting obstacles in the way of a son marrying merely because she selfishly wishes to keep the boy within the family circle. The parent argues that the marriage would cause inconvenience or less revenue to the family household, or that she is too delicate to be left alone. So the boy, through a sense of duty, gives up the chance of a happy marriage and selflessly devotes his life to looking after the selfish parent. He does not always realize that the parent is selfish, though it is a fact for anyone to see. The karmic result of such selfishness is that it must be considered as only fair if in a future life this woman would fall in love with someone only for that person to die or be killed before the marriage could take place. After many years recovering from this loss, that this same woman finds that another individual has fallen in love with her. There appear to be no reasons why things should not work out right on this occasion, but fate may again take a hand in the game of life, with the result that one of the contracting parties develops an incurable disease which puts marriage out of the question. As people do not know the reason behind such happenings, they are inclined to think that the person concerned is a plaything of an unkind creator. But such is not the case, for you cannot suffer in any way unless you yourself have produced the cause for that suffering. Question: why are some people born under a, quote, lucky star with plenty of money, good health, and every seeming advantage, whereas others are born in the slums with no natural advantages and often with disease inherited from their parents? Answer: the environment into which every man is born is made by himself in a previous incarnation, also in accordance with the law of karma. When a man is born under what you call a, quote, lucky star, with lots of money and perfect health, the world naturally feels that he has indeed been blessed by a divine providence. But this opportunity of an easy life is only accorded to one who deserves it. The man who is born in the slums with many limitations and perhaps hereditary disease, is considered unfortunate. But I can assure you that he too has earned what he receives. To find an instance of a man who has earned the right to be born with a quote silver spoon in his mouth, end quote, you have to look amongst the poor people of the world to find examples of this kind. How often have you seen generosity by an individual who is not blessed with many of this world's goods, but nevertheless goes out of his way to assist others less fortunate than himself? Such a person is only too often taken advantage of by unscrupulous people. Generous actions such as these people perform earn for them the right to be born in very different circumstances in a future existence, and they very seldom lose the opportunities which great wealth provides, for they continue to help their fellow man as they did in the past, with benefit to themselves and the world. If these opportunities are wasted, then the man makes bad karma instead of good, and it would have been better for him had he been born into circumstances less favorable from a worldly point of view. It is not necessarily a great misfortune for a man to be born in humble circumstances. In such cases, he has the opportunity to overcome the limitations of his environment through his own efforts. We often see such men surmount the obstacles of their birth and emerge successful, even leaders of their generations. It takes courage to do this, yet the efforts made not only improve a man's character, but enable him to make much good karma in that incarnation. His efforts and his refusal to be deterred by those natural limitations will usually ensure that in the life to follow, his environment will be much more favorable. Question: can you explain why some races are born with colored skins and others with white skins? Is a man with white skin always more evolved than a man with a colored skin? Is it a good thing for individuals of different races to marry? Is a white man ever reborn into a colored race once he has inhabited a white body? Answer: from a spiritual point of view, there is no reason to suppose that a white skin is necessarily better than a colored skin. The color of a man's skin does not denote his standing in evolution. It is usually due to climate prevailing in the country in which he is born. The question of which nation a man will be born into is usually decided for him, though the ego is given a certain amount of choice. Before his return to physical life begins, the ego is shown the particular characteristics which he lacks, and because each nation has special characteristics of its own, expressed by practically all the members of that nation, an ego is usually born as a child of a family forming part of a nation whose predominant virtues and characteristics that ego lacks in order, pardon me, in order that these may be built into his future structure. I'm going to pause this so I can do a little coughing and a little drinking of water, and then I'll be right back. Okay, back to the book. Many thousands of years ago, the parts of this planet which were principally inhabited by men were the countries where you now find the indigenous people having colored skins. Although Australia is today a white man's country, the Aborigines of Australia were black men. In South Africa, the original inhabitants were dark-skinned people, and although there are large numbers of these still living, South Africa today is controlled by the white man. All of us have, in our early incarnations, occupied dark-skinned bodies. As civilization advanced, the countries now known as the West became inhabited, and in order that these countries should be developed as quickly as possible, the perfected men who supervise the rise and fall of nations arranged for some of the more advanced egos in the world to be born as children of the pioneers who inhabited Western countries. Because the climate in these countries was generally much colder than the climate in the Eastern countries, the sun had less effect on the skin of these individuals, with the result that white races came into being. Progress today emanates mostly from Western nations, and because of that, it is desirable that the most experienced men in the world, the older souls, should be born in Western bodies. Great Britain has been the ruling nation for the past century or more, and has therefore received her due quota of advanced egos. But now America is taking over the responsibilities of that difficult position. It is certainly not chance which decides whether a man is born an Englishman, an American, or a German or Chinese. It must be obvious to you that all men with white skins are not more evolved than all men with colored skins. Every nation in the world requires a certain number of experienced and evolved egos to lead it and help with its progress in evolution. So, a certain number of old souls are always born into every nation. Take, for example, India. In that country, you find millions of unevolved beings. But you also find a large number of intellectual advanced beings and many extremely spiritually minded men. India has always been a country whose inhabitants thought a great deal about spiritual development. Believe me, it has an ancient culture, and it will also play a great part in the progress of the world in centuries to come. Obviously, it is necessary for such a country to have egos born into it who can guide the destiny of its countless millions so that in future years it can play the part allotted to it. Whether individuals of different races should marry is a difficult question to decide. It may sometimes happen that individuals who are born into different nations have been linked in past lives through marriage, for example. When these people meet in this life as members of different nations, the attraction which drew them together in the past may still be as strong as before. In some cases, it might be advantageous for such people to marry again. Only by investigating the individual past experiences of both parties could one give an opinion that would be of value. I feel, though, that usually it is most undesirable for white men to marry colored women, or the reverse, for the habits and culture of the different races do not mix well. Therefore, such a marriage does not work out to the advantage of either person. And I'd like to say here that, of course, this is experienced in 1941 and written in the 50s. Personally, I don't see where this is an issue at this moment of now in our uh, history. But that's just a personal observation and feeling and has nothing to do with what supposedly is. The result may also be that half-caste children are brought into the world, and it is apparent that sometimes these suffer from the accident of their birth. A man who is born in a white body does not necessarily return to Earth as a member of a white population in his next incarnation. This again is a matter of karma and of many circumstances, so that no general reply can be given to a question of this sort. In the case of a white man who, through a feeling of superiority, exploited other members of the human race merely because they had colored skins, the law of cause and effect would come into action. He would probably be forced to be born into a colored race in his next incarnation so that he might learn the lessons of tolerance and understanding, which he so obviously lacked in his former existence. Question. You have not said what happens to a man who commits suicide. Is such an act a great crime? Answer. The taking of one's own life is not only a crime, but is also an extremely foolish act. You do not solve your difficulties by running away from them, but merely postpone their solution for a future life. A man would argue that the circumstances which he has to face are the cause of his getting out of life, whereas they are the circumstances which have been judged necessary for his progress in evolution, and he must go through them sooner or later, in exactly the same way that a child who plays truant from school will be kept back in the lower form for another term, and until he has realized that in order to qualify for a higher form, he must obtain at least a minimum number of marks in all subjects. So when the man who commits suicide returns to the world in his next life, a group of circumstances will again arise, forming exactly the same obstacles and difficulties from which he now runs away. He must then face them and overcome them. For if he runs away once more, he is merely delaying his own evolution, and until he has faced and overcome these obstacles, and thus learned the lessons they were meant to teach him, he cannot advance any further on the journey towards perfection. Extreme remorse usually follows an act of suicide, and within a very short time of their arrival in the astral world, the majority of suicides would give anything to undo their action. Unfortunately, they cannot go back, but must wait until the time arrives for their next incarnation, and they are left in no doubt whatever that in their next life they will have to face the same difficulties again. Because the man suffers so much from remorse, and because he would give anything to get back into his physical body, even though it would mean facing up to the consequences, he often refuses to make the effort of will necessary for him to get rid of his etheric vehicle, which you will remember winds itself round the astral body at the moment of death. On account of this clinging etheric vehicle, he is what is known as, quote, earthbound, just so long as he remains obstinate and refuses to get rid of it. Being a suicide, he does not get the same sympathetic help from the astral helpers as you have seen is selflessly given to all who pass to the next world in the normal way. Thus, he may remain earthbound through ignorance, being unable to function properly either in the physical or in the astral world, feeling the extreme loneliness that exists under these circumstances. After a period which seems like an eternity, he will, through a changed state of mind, draw towards him a helping hand, after which he can commence his life under astral conditions. The exceedingly unpleasant conditions ruling in that no man's land sometimes make a man so bitter against his creator and mankind in general that he wanders about the place where he took his life, trying to influence other people to do the same thing. The reason for this is the awful loneliness of his present condition, and he feels that if he can persuade others to do what he has done, he will not be entirely alone in his misery. On very rare occasions, he succeeds in this effort, and the karmic result of such a deed means that he must suffer greatly in the life that is to come. Suicide is never a release, only a postponement, and no circumstances in the world are so bad that a man should resort to such methods of evading them. Question: if there is a God or deity controlling our lives, why does he allow wars, particularly as the majority of mankind desire peace? Answer: why do you suggest that wars are made or allowed to be by a creator? Wars are quite definitely the result of man's actions and his aggressive tendencies. There will be wars so long as there are separate nations in the world, and while some nations wish to rule and exploit other nations, there is national karma as well as individual karma, and the groups of people who have banded themselves together as a specific nation and have interfered with the life of another nation must always bear the consequences of such actions, whether good or bad. In many cases, a nation will argue that it meant well for the people, for the peoples whom it conquered. But history has usually proved that a conquered nation never quite settles down under the heel of a conqueror, nor can it evolve as quickly as when it is left alone to work out its own salvation. Wars beget wars, and so it will be until mankind realizes that all members of the human race are members of the same human family, who should be treated with sympathy and understanding and be given help as a matter of course. In due time, there will be no separate nations, for all men will live in harmony together, each group exchanging with others the things which the part of the world in which they live can most easily produce, together with the manufactured articles which their training has enabled them to perfect. Wait a minute, that didn't feel right. Let me see what this is. Let me go back and reread that. Looks like a very long sentence or something. In due time, there will be no separate nations, for all men will live in harmony together, each group exchanging with others the things which the part of the world in which they live can most easily produce, together with the manufactured articles which their training has enabled them to perfect. Separate nations will then become merely states in a world nation, and wise men drawn from each group will govern and legislate for the good of all. It is quite true that the majority of men desire peace, but unfortunately, peace or war is usually decided by those who happen to be in power at the moment. The responsibility of any nation or any group of men for launching a war such as we are passing through at the moment is great indeed, and it is seldom, if ever, that such a war can be justified, whatever the arguments may be that are put forward in an endeavor to prove that there was no other way out. The world will soon realize that even the nations which win modern wars lose in the end. And after a war, the conditions ruling in the world are so difficult that any advantages they seem to gain are outweighed by the post war problems they must face. Never think that wars are desired by the powers that control creation. These perfected men do everything in their power to lead humanity along the paths of peace and progress, but their efforts are limited because man has been granted free will. That is his particular heritage as a member of the human kingdom. Question. When people are very evolved, do they automatically achieve the continuity of consciousness, which enables them to remember what they do whilst out of their bodies during sleep? Answer. My answer depends on what you conceive to be an evolved man. The average man has from 5 to 600 incarnations in different bodies during the time that elapses between his first and his last life as a human being, having then passed the fifth initiation and become an adept. Although about 600 lives are usually necessary to learn all the lessons that this world has to teach, it is only during the last 50 lives or so that a man develops occultly and learns to use the faculties latent in all men, such as intuition, clairvoyance, and the power consciously to get out of his body whenever the necessity arises. For all general purposes, you can assume that an evolved man has developed these faculties, but it's possible for one not to evolve. But it is possible for one not so evolved to be given the opportunity of developing along this particular line, and your own case should serve to illustrate my point. You probably have more than 50 incarnations in front of you before you reach the stage of a perfect man. But because your need was great, you have been granted special tuition, and in return, I hope that you will show your gratitude by passing on this knowledge to others less fortunate than yourself. If you continue to work as you are working now, you will find that your memory of what happens to you when you are out of your body becomes clearer and clearer, and your knowledge of the life beyond the grave will enable you to progress much more quickly than is usual. At the same time, it will bring you much peace and contentment of mind. Do not imagine that having been able to develop this faculty, you are different from or superior to many others who probably would have welcomed a similar opportunity to yours. Pride is always a danger, for it is often responsible for help being withdrawn from an individual, with the result that such a man falls back into the slough of despond. That's interesting because slough and despond were both capitalized there. I don't recall that from the first reading. That's interesting. Question. Are we born an equal number of times as men and women, or is sex just chance? Answer. Your last question is an easy one. No, sex is not just chance, and we are not born an equal number of times as men and women. It is only possible to develop certain characteristics in female bodies and others in male bodies. By the time we reach perfection, we shall all have developed to a minimum extent all the virtues that add up to the ideal of a perfect man, and much more than a minimum in some of them. A man who develops through action naturally is a different character from one who develops through leading a saintly life and through a capacity to meditate for long periods in an endeavor to help his fellow men. All types of perfected beings are necessary, and many are the ways taken by us to fulfill our destiny. It kind of speaks to what I have been feeling all along, that there are as many ways to enlightenment as there are beings on the planet. If an individual should lack courage and the capacity to make sound decisions and to rule faithfully over his fellow men, it would probably mean that such a person might have to be born in a male body for 2 or 3 consecutive lives, so that he would have ample opportunity for the development he needed. If, on the other hand, an individual lacked the instinct called maternal or even paternal, and also was incapable of that selfless devotion and capacity to love a person, even when that love was spurned, it would probably mean that a life or 2 in a female body would be desirable, so that these lessons might be learned. In theory, one should inhabit the same number of male and female bodies in the total number of lives which we live. But in practice, it does not work out that way. For some people develop more easily in one type of body than they do in the other. In due time, when a man reaches perfection, he should have all the outstanding qualities of both sexes reasonably well developed. When you have an opportunity of meeting some of these perfected men, you will find that what I have told you is indeed true. Achara continued. This brings me to the end of your questions, and after you have transcribed your shorthand notes and read them through, I hope you will find that the answers I have given clarify the points you have raised. If I were you, I should have an early night, for you must be tired, and I would not bother about concentrating before going to sleep on remembering in the morning what you did tonight. I shall not visit you again for at least a week, so you will have plenty of opportunity to experiment on your own, and as I told you yesterday, if you get into any difficulty, I shall be near to help you. Peace be with you, my son. I will leave you now. And I could give a long description of the many incidences which took place the following week, but instead I shall summarize the highlights. On the very first night, I managed to make my way to Daphne's cottage, where I found her entertaining friends. I was introduced to and had interesting conversations with several of them on current events in the world, on which topics I found them to be very well informed. Several movie films were shown for my benefit, depicting the gardens attached to the bungalows in this valley. These gardens were much more beautiful than any I had seen before. When gardens were shown which were not laid out in any way, I saw nature spirits, tiny people who couldn't be much more than 5 to 6 inches high, judging by comparison with the flowers I knew, dancing in and out of the pictures. When they lighted on a flower, the stem gave a slight tremor, as it would if a large butterfly or bumblebee did the same thing. They are indeed perfect replicas of the fairies described in the books beloved by children of all ages. I know, because I have played with them as a child. I remember. Oh, and it always makes me smile. Um, with one important difference, the complete absence of wings. And this can be understood, for logically, wings are quite unnecessary at the level where these nature spirits exist. I don't recall seeing wings. I guess I just assumed that they had them because I did see them levitate. And so I don't know, I guess I just assumed that they were there. On the second night, I got out of my body, meaning to visit the third sphere once more. But when I found myself hovering immediately above the bed on which my body was lying, the first thing I heard was the voice of Charles speaking to me in uncharacteristic army dialect. He said, "It's about time you looked me up. I've been here at least 3 times since the night when you and your Indian friend came to London with me. Each time your old body was here, but you had gone. I didn't know where you had pushed off to, so I couldn't follow you. This time I decided to come early so as to be sure to catch you." "My dear Charles," I said, "I'm terribly sorry. I didn't know you had been looking for me, for I have been exceedingly busy and very interested indeed in all that I have seen." "What about going up to your little turret room, which I remember used to be a favorite of yours?" said Charles. "Then we can have a long talk, just like old times." "Good idea, old chap. Let's go." So we went up to my sanctum, where we chatted over old days, and I told him more or less everything that had happened to me up to date. Charles said, "I'm damn glad you've been so lucky as to meet Achara, for it worried me after I died to see how extremely depressed and miserable you were. I tried my damnedest to speak to you, but couldn't make you hear. We had been jolly good pals in the old days, even though I always looked on you as donkeys years older than me. I appreciate all you've done for me ever since the days when you started to teach me football and gave me my first lesson in how to hold a bat. What a funny thing life is. My idea used to be more or less to have a good time and get the best out of life that I could, and possibly later to marry some nice girl and have a family. When I first met Achara, he impressed me with the fact that a man doesn't change after death. It is the conditions under which he lives that are different. And I have found that quite true. "Yes," I replied. "I gathered from Achara that you had not been exactly miserable. He said you had linked up with some girl who had recently left the world. Is that so?" Did he blush, or was I imagining it? "Yes, that's true enough," said Charles. "I think it passes the time to have a girl pal to wander around with. In her case, I'm afraid it tickles my vanity, for she thinks I'm a hell of a fellow, just because I know a little more than she does. She didn't have a very good time in the world, so I suppose this moving around, seeing shows, and going to restaurants is thrilling for a time." "Oh, Charles," I said, "there's one thing I want to ask you. Is there any sex relationship at your level after you've dropped the physical body?" This time I'm quite sure he blushed, but he went on. "Well, yes, there is, of a kind, and I think most people indulge in it, but it's not quite the same thing as on the physical plane. One leads up to things in the same way, and although I would probably have felt just as shy about talking of my secret love affairs had you asked me the same question before I died, I suppose I feel just a wee bit shy of talking about these things now. I said, I didn't mean to be personal. I'm just interested in getting as much information as I can about the differences between conditions in the physical and the astral worlds and at various levels of the latter. I told you about my coming up against Daphne on one of the higher levels where she is already studying music. I was very much in love with Daphne when she was alive and would have asked her to marry me as soon as I was able to support a wife, although we never experienced the physical relationship of marriage. I feel that the platonic association we shall carry on now at these higher levels will not only last through our astral existence, but will be of great benefit to us in our next incarnation. What about coming along with me tonight and letting me introduce you to Daphne? Yes, I'd like to, said Charles. I suggested a date for Thursday night, to which he agreed. Charles said he had recently made contact with our father, who had died some years previously. From his description, I gathered that father was living at the second sphere. Charles described how he had found him surrounded by rose bushes. This was as I had known him in my boyhood days. This, this was as I had known him in my boyhood days. He said that the last time he had seen him, father was distressed because a Scotch terrier, which had attached itself to him, had suddenly disappeared, and he felt it had been lost. I explained to Charles what had really happened, but he showed little interest. We talked on till a peculiar feeling of restlessness came over me. I had just time to say to Charles not to forget Thursday when I woke in my bed with no remembrance of how I got there. It was on Wednesday night I had a most disturbing experience, a nightmare in which Daphne took part. It seemed that Daphne and I were in a dark cave. For some reason, we could not escape from a loathsome gorilla-like creature who was seated on the floor close to us, glowering at Daphne, who obviously attracted it in some horrible way. I know that in my dream I wanted to protect Daphne, but the gorilla was of such a size and strength that I knew I would have no chance against it. It seemed highly amused at our efforts to escape, for it emitted wild yells and hoarse laughter as we ran hither and thither around the cave, trying to find an exit. Even in my dream, sweat poured from my brow, and I tried to think of Achara in the hope he would come to our assistance. But nothing happened, and we seemed left to our fate. After a little time, the gorilla rose to its feet and advanced towards Daphne, whom it grasped with its horrible, long, hairy arms and commenced to drag her to the other end of the cave. Daphne screamed and resisted to the best of her ability, and in desperation I hurled myself at the horrible creature, and, although I had no weapon, I endeavored to get my hands on its throat, in the hope that it would turn its attentions to me. Even now I can still smell the fetid breath of the brute, for in the middle of the fight I woke in my bed, sweating profusely and with the bedclothes all tangled about me. I haven't the slightest idea what it all means. I shall check up with Daphne as soon as possible in the hope she knows something about it. Thursday was the night I began my career as an astral helper. This was the night on which I had arranged to take Charles to the third sphere. Charles was late, and when he arrived, he was in an agitated condition because he said a pal of his, Bill Fletcher, had just crashed and been killed in a raid over London. He asked me to come with him and help, so we set out at once for London. Charles knew where to look for Bill, and our assistance was welcomed by 3 inexperienced but eager astral helpers. After about 2 hours hard work on the part of all of us, Bill was persuaded to make the effort of will to free himself from his etheric body, and at once became quite a different person. Charles and I took charge of him. We went with him to his home, where he did what he could to prepare his young wife for the news she would receive the following morning. As Charles then undertook to remain with Bill, saying he knew only too well what the poor devil was suffering, I went back to the scene of the raid to see if I could be of further assistance. An ambulance passed me, so I decided to follow it. It was driven to one of the big London hospitals, and a stretcher on which a young girl was lying was carefully carried into the building. The same girl in her astral body was walking, in a very agitated condition, close behind the stretcher. After examination, the body of the girl was carried into one of the wards already filled with recent casualties. Without any fuss or hurry, and an efficiency at which I greatly marveled, the girl was put to bed, and arrangements were made for giving her a blood transfusion. Pardon me just a moment. She was frantically trying to communicate with the doctors and nurses attending to her unconscious body, but after a short time, she listened to what I had to say. I told her she would be all right, for intuitively I knew this was so. I told her that it would help if she became calm and watched the proceedings at the same time, using her willpower to aid the efforts of the doctors and nurses. I don't know now why I suggested this to her. I hadn't the slightest idea whether it would help or not, but it came to me to say this, and so I did. I could see quite clearly that there was a thin line of etheric matter stretched between her astral body and physical form lying on the hospital bed, so I knew that she was not dead, and was sure she would not die. I stayed talking with her for the rest of my night, and after she had told me that the house in which she lived was next door to the one that received a direct hit, and that she was very worried indeed as to the fate of her old mother, began to give her a little of the knowledge which had recently been given to me. There were other astral helpers moving about the ward, and one of them, whom I had not seen before, but who said his name was Jim, congratulated me on my efforts, saying that he wished there were more people with the necessary knowledge who would help in similar emergencies. I had an experience so unique during Friday night that I must describe the night's activities in some detail. I found Daphne in her room at the academy. One of the first things I asked her about was her part in my nightmare, but she assured me she was not present. We decided we should try to get to the next sphere, the 4th, on our own, but were faced with the problem that neither of us had a landmark there to visualize. We sat down outside and concentrated. I tried to see a mental hospital such as Achara had mentioned, but nothing happened. I wished we had Achara to help us, and must have made a thought form of him, because after our next attempt had failed, I heard a chuckle behind me, and there he was. He said he would help us and give us landmarks on each sphere which we must memorize. We linked hands with him, And when I opened my eyes, the scene that met them cannot adequately be described, for it was the most beautiful valley I had ever seen. It was partly wooded, and the ground was covered with a thick heather of varied colors, which one sees to perfection in South Africa, but soft to the touch. Intermingled with this, wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Side by side, I saw primroses, bluebells, daffodils, forget-me-nots, tulips, wild roses, and the most vivid red poppies that could be imagined. I'm sure no variety of wildflower was missing, for the ground near and far was a veritable carpet of colors of breathtaking beauty. I thought you would be pleased with this landmark, said Achara, for it is called the Fairy Glen. It could be described as the cradle of the Deva kingdom, for it is the valley to which the members of this evolution return after they have finished the particular work allotted to them. I suggest you both investigate the valley on some future occasion, quietly and unobtrusively, for the Devas have their own methods of keeping away Philistines among men. They build a thick wall of astral matter, which makes it impossible for any human being to see beyond. Even if they knew this place existed, such walls serve the same purpose at this level as do brick walls in the physical world. Once more, we joined hands and willed ourselves to the next level, the fifth. On opening my eyes, it seemed uncanny to find that we were standing on an open plain like a desert, except that there was grass in the place of sand. In the distance was a huge city with many spires and towers, surrounded by an immense wall. Above the city shone something in the nature of a sun, for it spread a glow over all the buildings, which made them shine like gold. That, my friends, is the Golden City, said our guide, and I advise you to visit and study it. You will find within everything that has ever been thought of or imagined as likely to be found in Orthodox heaven, so much talked of by priests and ministers attached to the Christian creed. The whole city is a huge thought form, and you will find therein thought forms of God the Father, of Christ and his 12 disciples, and the many saints who have figured into the teachings of the church. Again, we linked hands and willed ourselves to the sixth level. Within a second, we were standing on the edge of a lake, which was surrounded by a high wall of rock. In the distance, on our left, was to be seen a very small opening. I wondered where it led. Make a clear picture of this scene, advised Achara. This lake is used principally by members of the human race who desire absolute silence for their particular work. There is one sect in the world which evolves entirely through meditation exercises. Here I'm going to pause for just a moment so I can, now I got to tinkle. This is a very long chapter. I'll be right back. There is one sect in the world which evolves entirely through meditation exercises. They are taught during their lifetime that there is this place, in rather the same way that Christians are taught that there is a place called heaven. The small boats you see are used by the men who come here, For when they are afloat, it is impossible for one boat to be overtaken by another. This is due to some underwater currents which cause the boats to drift around the entire lake. It takes 24 hours Earth time for a boat to return to its starting place, and the meditation exercises carried out by these people take exactly that time to complete. I saw you noticed the small opening on the left that leads to another similar but smaller lake, also surrounded by high cliffs. This lake was produced by an individual who sojourned here. One day he was interrupted in his meditation by other human beings using the lake at the same time as himself. The thought form he made was so strong that he produced a lake all for himself. I have spoken to you here in a voice which is hardly above a whisper. Had I spoken in my usual voice, you would have heard it reverberating around the lake like thunder. The people in the vicinity know about this unusual feature and take good care never to make a sound. Because of this peculiarity, the lake is called the Waters of Perpetual Silence. Now I must leave you. You should find no difficulty in returning without my assistance. As he had surmised, Daphne and I found no difficulty in retracing our steps. But when we reached the fourth sphere and once more saw the fairy glen, we decided to remain there for a short time. We noticed there were signs of great activity in the valley, as if some sort of ceremony were about to take place. There seemed to be thousands of inhabitants gathering in the valley. We sat down to watch. Our presence was noticed by some, quote, officials, and when one of them moved toward us, we rather expected to be asked to go away, particularly as Achara had warned us that members of our evolution were not always welcome here. The man who slowly and in a dignified manner floated toward us had a very fine intellectual head and spiritual dignity which made us rise to our feet instinctively as he reached us. His costume was strange to us. It resembled that of a Chinese mandarin. The colors of the long coat were exquisite, whilst the embroidery clearly portrayed many of the wild flowers that bloomed in the valley. The expression on his face did not seem to augur trouble for us, so we smiled in return, hoping that our attitude would assure him. What followed was a little uncanny, for it was a conversation conducted without a word being uttered. Question and answer followed one upon the other, far more quickly than would have been possible had words been our medium of expression. I felt he had asked me whether he could do anything for us. I told him, merely by allowing the thought to express itself in my mind, that Daphne was a permanent inhabitant of the astral world, whereas I was still living in a physical body in the world and was here during the period when my body was sleeping. He seemed to understand perfectly and said he had been instructed by his chief to bring us to him. We intimated that we were only too willing to accompany him and at once moved toward the central arena. As we approached, I saw that people were standing and sitting around a large open circle. Wildflowers had been strung together to keep back the crowds, and I could not help comparing the beauty of that, quote, fence with those we see in the world. Just within the circle, a dais had been erected, made entirely of great clumps of green moss with pillars at each corner, formed of intertwined flowers of every size and color. Even the awning above the dais was made of a very delicate fern, not unlike our maidenhair variety. The whole formed a most beautiful picture. The moss on the floor of the dais had been laid in such a way that there appeared to be numerous seats with shaped backs, which looked so comfortable that one immediately wished to sit down. At the front there were two large seats, almost like thrones, and although these two were composed of moss, they were more ornate than the others. Whilst we waited for the "chief" to appear, our guide told us something of what was about to take place. The gist of what he said was that the crowd had gathered together to witness a graduation ceremony. He explained that when the time came for a group of nature spirits to pass to the next stage of their evolution, which was to become devas, they had to give proof of their proficiency at one of these gatherings. Providing they satisfied a council of examiners, they were changed from nature spirits into devas, with more responsible duties. He said that the younger egos evolved along one of three special lines of work. One, the power line, working through music and color. Two, the guidance of the vegetable kingdom, which derived its change and progress from experiments made at the astral level by members of the Deva evolution. And three, work in connection with the human kingdom. He explained that the nature spirits mixed quite frequently with human beings, particularly children. They often played with those who came to the astral world at an early age and taught them how to make use of the plastic astral matter, so as to live their fairy stories in very truth, by changing at will, so as to represent any figure of fiction for so long as required, and so long as the thoughts of those taking part lasted. It was impressed on me that this sphere of the astral world is for the Deva kingdom what the physical world is for the human kingdom. Between lives, birds return to this fourth sphere, in the same way that animals inhabit the sixth and seventh spheres. When they are awaiting their return to the world, birds, as well as fish, butterflies, and many other winged creatures, eventually change into nature spirits and are part of the Deva evolution. They never become part of our human evolution. I don't know why I feel like that's not exactly so. I'm not quite sure what that's about, but at this stage, a group emerged from a nearby coppice. If ever I had imagined the fairy story of the magic carpet come to life, surely this was it. The group consisted of two central figures, both seated cross-legged on what can only be described as a ceremonial carpet, floating about a yard above the ground. From each front corner, strands of flowers were held in the beaks of numerous birds of every color imaginable. And whilst these flew overhead, seemingly pulling the carpet along, the other devas taking part in the procession floated majestically on either side of it. More little birds flew backwards and forwards, dropping rose petals in the path of the procession, each bird swooping down to the ground, picking a petal with its beak from the rose bushes that grew everywhere, and at once returning to its position ahead of the procession, from where the petal was dropped. Whilst the procession slowly wended its way, the air was filled with the notes issuing from the throats of thousands of birds of all types. The procession reached its destination, and the two central figures were escorted to the special thrones prepared for them on the dais. The first of the two figures was the quote, chief, and the second, the high priest, judging from the ceremonial robes that he wore. As the other officials took their place on the dais, our guide presented Daphne and me to the chief, who intimated that we were to seat ourselves on the platform. Daphne was offered a seat at his right hand, and I was offered a seat to the immediate left of the high priest. Before the ceremony proper commenced, some music was played by a large orchestra, composed entirely of devas. It was of an extremely cheerful and melodious character. After the orchestra had finished playing, there was silence again. Even the myriads of birds uttered no sound whatsoever. A herald then entered the inner circle and with a small silver trumpet proclaimed the first part of the ceremony. A small group of nature spirits came into the arena. Although no words were spoken, a question passed from the principal examiner to this group. It related to the expression of sounds as representing a slowly moving river lazily passing through a wooded country with tall trees on either side of the riverbank. At once the group produced wind instruments and a curious sort of guitar. They commenced to play, and I saw the thought form slowly take shape, showing exactly what they were endeavoring to illustrate through sound. This was immediately followed by another order to produce music that expressed the elements. At once, the instruments were changed. Several drums, one set of cymbals, and two other larger and quite unusual wind instruments, rather like oboes, were produced. Again, they played, and it was not difficult to realize, even without looking at the thought form so clearly outlined before us, that a storm at sea was the subject of the theme then played. One could almost hear the creaking of the stays and the halyards strained to their utmost by the force of the gale. Thunder and lightning played their part, and as this group finished, the crowd stood up as a body, raising their hands to the sky instead of clapping and cheering as we would do. That was all the first group was asked to do, and I was sure the members had successfully passed their test. The second group was now heralded into the circle. There were only 5 of them. They were asked to demonstrate the result of certain graftings as related to both flowers and shrubs and to different kinds of fruit. The answers appeared immediately as thought form pictures, showing very clearly the changes in size and color. They were also asked what kinds of flowers could be grown together in one bed, and which kinds meant death to one or more of the species. Then questions concerning crop rotation and why it was necessary. This second group also seemed to satisfy both examiners and the crowd. The silver trumpet sounded again, and the third group of very small nature spirits then entered the circle, and thought forms of 3 human children were created by the examiners. They were typical fair-haired English children of an age between 5 and 7. They discussed the fairy story of Cinderella. At once, they were joined by the nature of the spirit. They were joined by the nature spirits who entered into the spirit of the game. They argued as to who should take the principal part, and when this was settled, I noticed that the nature spirits took over the parts that children usually object to play. They became the ugly sisters and the unpleasant father, leaving the parts of Cinderella, the fairy godmother, and the prince for the children. A short version of the play was enacted, but the transformation scenes covering the fairy cottage and the change of Cinderella's clothes were much more realistic than anything that has ever been produced under the physical playing conditions. I imagine the unselfishness shown by the little nature spirits made the difference between passing or failing the test. After a short interval with cheerful music, all the members of the 3 groups who had been examined were called back into the arena. The herald sounded the entrance on his silver trumpet. The examiners grouped round the chief and high priest, then drew together as if to confer on what they had seen, and after a few moments the chief examiner stood before the chief and obtained his consent for the nature spirits to be promoted to the deva rank. The high priest then rose to his feet, bowed to the chief, and solemnly walked to the arena, into the arena where the nature spirits were standing. For the first time, words were used. The high priest, raising his hands above his head, intoned an invocation in the same unknown language I had heard in the glade on the 3rd sphere. The herald then handed him a sword, a large sword, the blade of which shone brightly in the clear astral light. Raising it towards the sky, he uttered more words and slowly walked towards the first of the nature spirits, who stood in one long line in front of him. He placed the sword on the head of the first and said 2 words which seemed to mean, "Go with thee, God go with thee." Although why I thought this, I do not know. God go with thee, though I thought this, I do not. Oh, again, I just read that. And as I watched, the form of the nature spirit, which had appeared to be that of a little old man, changed to that of a young girl. The same thing happened to all the graduates. Some male nature spirits became male devas, whereas others changed their sex. All the newly created bodies were young in appearance. I was about to thank the chief for the wonderful opportunity offered to us when, without any warning, I felt my body calling me and found myself awake in bed in Colombo. On the following Saturday night, when I got out of my body, I found Jim, the astral helper. I met him in the London hospital, waiting for me. He had come to ask for my help. He stated that he had been very impressed by the way in which I had handled the case of the girl, whose name was Mary, on Thursday night, and felt I could give further help. This girl had learned from a thoughtless visitor that her mother had been killed in the raid, and was so upset that no one could do anything with her. As there was a young sister, Irene, aged 7, it would be a tragedy if Mary died too. I was only too glad to have this opportunity of putting into practice what I had recently learned. When we reached the ward, I saw Mary's fever-racked body tossing on the bed, whilst the girl herself was pacing the ward, metaphorically tearing her hair. She welcomed my arrival, and as I talked soothingly to her, she quieted down. I made a thought form of a comfortable settee, and whilst we sat there, I gave her what help I could from the knowledge which had been given me by Achara. I brought the conversation round to Irene and pointed out how she would suffer if both her mother and sister died. I assured Mary with an authority I did not possess that she could live if she made the effort, and if she elected to do so, she would still be able to contact her mother during sleep. She asked me if I would help her. I promised to do so, and thus took on myself a measure of responsibility. I said I would return the following night. On the Sunday night, Mary was waiting for me and was quite calm. I suggested we look for her mother. I showed her how easy it was to travel under astral conditions, and soon this method of progress both interested and intrigued her. She took me to the block of flats where they lived. She found Irene in a neighbor's flat, and by her bedside, her mother was sitting, endeavoring to comfort the weeping child, who could not see her. At first, the mother thought Mary was dead too, but when she realized this was not the case, and that she would be able to care for Irene, she calmed down. I left the three of them to chat, and after arranging to meet them there later, returned to the hospital. I watched Jim and his colleagues working and made notes of their methods. When Mary, her mother, and Irene came in, I spent the rest of my night trying to help them in the way Achara had helped me. The mother was not a very highly evolved person. I had learned from an astral helper that it had taken 2 days to persuade her to make the effort of will to disconnect herself from her etheric body. At last, she seemed to grasp the link with her family was not broken, and that she would still see them at night. This made her much happier. I fancy she will be quite content with the first sphere conditions for some time. My last act before returning to my body was to use what willpower I possess to impress upon Irene that when she awakened, she must remember something of what she had been told during her sleep. Well, that's the end of chapter 9, and chapter 10 will be right next. I hope that you are enjoying this reading of A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu. And until we meet again, be well, my friends.